Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to be joined right now by Dr. Samaya Mushtaq, who is a board certified psychiatrist and writer based in Texas with an interest in well-being education, and you can connect with her on Substack at The Middle Path. Dr. Mushtaq, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Eleanor.
Absolutely. And I wanted to dive right in here into the dark synapses of the mind. And I wanted to start with a recent piece that you wrote on empathy requiring the ability to pay attention. And
Mhm.
I feel that that speaks a lot to what we're seeing politically across the globe right now and how different cultures and relationships with tech and, fast living affect empathy, both in policy and perspective, from the micro to the macro. And it seems that, everyone has some kind of ADD or ADHD, and no one has the ability
Mhm.
to even make it through like a Substack article without, picking this up and checking it.
Mhm.
So could you talk a little bit about what you see as this connection between empathy and attention, and what our seemingly ever shortening attention spans mean for our ability to access humanity?
Yeah, definitely. Well, when I initially wrote the piece, I myself was reading a book thinking on our declining attention spans and our ability to, or our inability, I should say, to really sustain focus in the way that we previously have been able to. And, there's a lot of hypotheses as to why obviously smartphones and social media tend to get a big brunt of that in terms of being the drivers of fragmentation. So, what I was really curious about is how that translates to our relational abilities. So, not just our individual attention spans, but what's happening relationally as a result of that decline. And when it comes to empathy, it really requires it's a skill. It requires certain cognitive processes to occur to feel empathy. People assume that it's an instinctive emotional experience that just happens, but something is going on in the mind when you're really sitting with someone, paying attention to their story and engaging with the emotional experience of their narratives. And those things can't successfully happen without attention. And so as attention declines, the ability to experience empathy, to attune to someone's emotional experience also declines. It also suffers.
Yeah, and I wanted to I wanted to dig into this a little bit more because something that you touched upon is obviously something that's at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, which is of course the genocide in Gaza. And I feel
Mhm,
like it's kind of a double-edged sword because, for instance, we're seeing the first live stream genocide unfold on our phones, but as you
mhm,
point out in a recent piece, quote, in that virtual world, we may not even feel the need to reach for empathy or compassion when that
mhm,
wailing child is no longer a human being in front of us, but simply content. A clip that
mhm,
was shortened to 15 seconds in someone's story or a reel that you can infinitely scroll away from to one
mhm,
that's more feel good or with positive vibes, end quote. And I want to get into the good vibes only BS in a minute.
mhm,
But for right now,
mhm.
I wanted to get your opinion on what that means for our, our monkey brains, like to be able to witness horrors that are so far away from us that
Yeah.
further dehumanize a already dehumanized culture. What does that do for us to be able to see it, but then also not really engage with it on a human level?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot around how oppression, colonialism, all of those phenomena, or all of those things, they dehumanize both the oppressor and the oppressed. It dehumanizes us. It reduces our humanity to disengage the way we have. It reduces our sense of agency. It increases our sense of powerlessness. For God's sake, you have billions of people all watching this saying, I wish there was more that I could do. It really it really balloons in us a sense of helplessness, right? I mean, it, it's 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 not just the Palestinians that are dehumanized. by this reduction of content. It's all of us. And we've done it to ourselves, right? I mean, before all of this, I have a lot I could say, of course, and I've written about it too around, just what social media has done to us. It rewires us. It really dehumanizes all of us. And even if it seems like we're presenting this curated good vibes image, that is still dehumanizing, right? It's still reducing the complexity of our own lives, only highlighting certain facets. And it just distills the entire human experience into this the best way I can put it is this curated single image flattens us completely.
Yeah, and, like, what does that do for because obviously when you're in a traumatic situation in real life, you can't just scroll past it. But when we're engaging with a genocide in a way that we can just scroll to somebody sitting on a beach having, like, a martini or something, what does that do to our ability to actually then empathize with somebody in real life if we have this kind of, blueprint in our brains, well, let me just scroll past this uncomfortable
Mhm.
conversation or
Mhm.
this trauma.
Yeah, yeah, there's this dissonance, right? And I actually think that what it does is a couple things. One, I think it really reduces our spans even more, right? Because it's this, like you mentioned, there's this discomfort, and it almost rewires us or perpetuates that instinct of I'm uncomfortable, let me distract myself from the discomfort. I don't want to sit with this discomfort. It hurts, it's painful. Let me distract. What happens is, and humans naturally have a bit of that tendency, right? There's a tendency to avoid pain and seek pleasure. That's natural. But it makes that much easier to do. It makes it more available to have the distraction right away. So to be able to act on that impulse and shift our behavior so that we can immediately actually distract ourselves, it cements that wiring. It makes it that much harder to stop doing that. And so we just easily act on our instinct to move on when we see this. It's almost a vicious cycle, right? Because then we're more conditioned to avoid, less conditioned to sit with discomfort. And then that sort of weakens that muscle to be able to then sit with discomfort. And look, it's not just virtual, right? I mean, this has implications in the real world too, because once you get used to that, once you start losing that skill of being able to sit with discomfort when it's occurring to someone else, you lose it across the board. If you're losing it towards someone across the world, you will naturally lose it to your neighbor and eventually even to yourself.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are because, it's kind of become like a trope to say like, "Oh, all of the politicians are sociopaths or psychopaths or some path."
Mhm.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how this connection between empathy and attention has reached like the higher rungs of the people who make policy and what your thoughts are on how that's creating policy that is just so clearly and overtly inhumane where you have people going,
Mhm.
I can't believe that they're this evil, but is
Mhm.
it really that they're that evil? Or I mean, maybe it is, but perhaps there is just like you said, empathy is a muscle that needs to be worked and nobody's working
Mhm.
it, including those that are
Mhm.
on the higher rungs of policy creation.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I have a couple of thoughts here. One is I don't think that it's certainly, we collectively there's a decline in our humanity because of all of these things, and I think that spills over into policy. But also, there's no way to talk about American policy in particular without talking about where the money comes from and where it goes and following the paper trail, right? And the unfortunate, brutal truth is that human beings and their humanity doesn't have the currency that dollars do, and that the value of that matters less in a society that runs on the dollar and runs on nothing else. There's a lot of financial interest in continuing the genocide in Gaza. Um, Even if the majority of Americans want it to end, it's requiring, again, the ability to mobilize, which we're not able to do collectively as well anymore when we've become so siloed. It requires, um, it requires shifting power back from uh, money and lobbies and special interests to people, and having those people be connected and organized. And all of those things suffer when we commodify attention, because there's value in keeping people distracted. It's not just, I mean, social media and our current digital products make money off of our distraction, right? The ads, the products, the things that influencers influence us to buy, consumption, all of that is monetized attention. And so it's really twofold, I think. And it kind of goes back to, again, we're distracted, and we're a society that overvalues money and undervalues human interest and humanity and collectivism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into I want to get into that like the capacity for empathy in a second, but I wanted to go back and talk about the good vibes only trope, because
Hmm.
I've talked about this a little bit before about like how happiness is a scam, in the sense that the
Hmm.
demand for people to be happy while the world
Hmm.
is literally and figuratively burning, it's really twisted, and it's a form of gaslighting us into thinking that like it's our own fault and our own failings
Hmm.
rather than
Hmm.
systemic ones that are driving our sense of dread and, keeping us from being oh so happy. If you just picked yourself up by your bootstraps, you'd be fine. What does
Hmm.
this sort of like this like gaslighting, just be happy, good vibes only, when
Hmm.
like every like sensory input that you're getting is to telling you things are not okay. This is not an okay
Hmm.
way to live. This is not life affirming. This is a death affirming system. What does that
Hmm.
do to us psychologically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you mentioned, there's this sense of failure then if you're not able to feel well and stable in an unstable society. The subject of one of my other notes was that's one of my main criticisms with the well-being industry that we have, is that there's this expectation that you can individually, meditate, talk your way out of therapy, out of financial insecurity. I mean, the majority of Americans don't have enough savings for a health emergency. Our healthcare is tied to our productivity because it's often through, employment. And we've stripped universal human needs and basic rights as privileges. And in a society like that, it's no wonder that you have rampant depression, rampant anxiety. How could you not be anxious when your bank account is down to triple digits, right? And um, there's sort of just like not enough policy discussion, I think, around why mental health is so poor in this country. We've focused a lot on individual outcomes and healthcare access, but we haven't focused enough on the policy and the social infrastructure that really drives this lack of joy. It's not just about being happy, but it's about having a life that has meaning, purpose, connectedness. And so many of our policies seem to be, counter to that. Um, I think the other thing too is there is sort of this idea, I mean, even in constitutionalized, right, about the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. At the same time, I come from a culture where that's not the end goal necessarily of life, is to be happy. And there's this understanding that life is difficult, it has challenges, and for some it has more than others, but that you create meaning regardless of your challenges, that you are connected to your family and your neighbors and your friends regardless. That is not the case here. The individualism that we have really limits our sense of those other aspects of meaning and joy. And when we're again disconnected and distracted, those things are even more pronounced. There's less connection and more anxiety, loneliness.
Yeah, and I wanted to dive into anxiety a little bit more because you wrote another piece that talked about how anxiety is a main driver of consumption. And I mean consumerism, not tuberculosis, but I do actually appreciate that they both have the same name. Um, so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how anxiety ties into like what you wrote about making us anxious about like what other people think of us and things like that, and yet
Mhm.
somehow not then recognizing the humanity of the other as we are
Mhm.
anxious about what they think. It
Mhm.
seems like so bizarre, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this anxiety then kind of drives this this sense of loneliness in a crowd of people that are also feeling that intense loneliness and sort of like forced individualism.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because like you mentioned, a lot of people now, and again in the social media age, are all preoccupied with how we're being perceived, right? What is someone thinking of me? And the ironic thing is, we're all worried about what everyone else is thinking, but nobody is actually thinking that much about us. So I think, and I mean, I can't, I'm not going to entirely blame social media in the sense that humans are wired for belonging. There's a deep need to feel connected to other people, intense fears of social rejection. Those are primal instincts. We don't want to be socially rejected. We want to exist in community. And that's a natural driver. But I think what's changed is how we interpret connectedness, how we know we have that sense of belonging. That is what shifted. So in our digital era, and Jonathan Haidt goes into this a lot in The Anxious Generation. He really mapped the rise of anxiety, particularly in adolescence, with the onset of smartphones, Instagram. And, I really think it's interesting that the selfie camera, Instagram, all of those things started at the same time. And it's very emblematic of flipping our view towards ourselves rather than outward towards other people. And so, these products created this idea that we need to star in life and portray that to thousands of people. So, I mean, I remember that experience of just how interesting it was that this product had conditioned so many people to behave so differently all of a sudden, right? Like this, it wouldn't have occurred to people to document every meal before. I mean, it seems normal now, but when I first got on it, it was very striking. I was just surprised that, like, and this kind of goes back to the piece I wrote about what people perceive as salient. It became salient to highlight the most mundane aspects of life. And then, of course, as Instagram evolved, it had to become more filtered and more curated to differentiate itself. But the whole idea of like showcasing and highlighting yourself as a star of your own movie, I think it really contributed to this idea of really the loss of connection. It created this really insane social competition, I think. And I think it's directly fed into consumption, right? Because a lot of, again, it's follow the money trail. I mean, Instagram is at its core a marketing platform. And the purpose of it is to market. That's how it's free, but it's not really free, right? Because that's how Instagram makes money, is through um, influencers who sell products, and Instagram provides a vehicle for advertising those things, and all of that. Again, it exists on consumption, so they have to make products compelling enough for you to buy them.
And there's also, like, there's this co-optation of language and how we because you see this a lot on Instagram or in social media, like, "This is our community. We're a family," and things like that. And I'm curious to hear
Mhm.
what your thoughts are in terms of how that also it I feel like it's almost worse than not having it because you feel like you have it and yet you still feel empty even though you have this quote unquote community, you have this family of people online and yet you still feel empty because it's not really community. So what does that do in terms of this anxiety and this loneliness?
Yeah, it almost makes it worse, right? Because you think that you're going to alleviate your loneliness by turning to this community, and then it's not meeting that need. And then you're even more alienated because you have the thing that's supposed to help, that's supposed to make you feel connected, and you're unmoored. And again, in the anxious generation, Jonathan Haidt talks about how real community has to be embodied community. It just cannot meet that same need, no matter how much we want it to. It has a role, don't get me wrong, I'm not demonizing it completely. It's allowed people to stay connected across the globe. People, even my extended family who wouldn't be able to see my kids grow up, I can share their milestones with them. But again, it doesn't replace my kids also playing with the neighbors' kids.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to ask you about how you then feel that that in particular drives the actual interactions that we do have, like in real life, especially when so much of our lives are in these, and you talk about this too, like these filter bubbles where we don't
Mhm,
actually get to choose. We think that we do, like we get to choose who
mhm,
we follow and but we're not actually choosing. We're not active participants. We're more passive ones. But in real life, like you don't get to choose who you sit with on the bus based on their political affiliation or based on where they
mhm,
shop or who they
mhm.
follow. So, how does this affect the way that we interact with people in real life when we're used to these filter bubbles in so much of our waking life?
Yeah, so I actually think it makes us even less tolerant of our ability to navigate in-person relationships with people who are different than us, because the algorithm feeds us sameness. It directs our attention towards this narrow segment of other influencers, other accounts that we might be interested in based on what we've previously engaged with. And it gives us this extremely narrow echo chamber, and then everything else is tuned out. And reality is not like that. When you get on the bus, you're sitting with a dozen people from completely different backgrounds. So it curates a world that is a, not based in reality, and B, is extremely segmented and isolated. And the spillover effect is that we just become so much less tolerant then to difference in the real embodied world. In the virtual world, you can block anything you don't want to see, anyone you don't want to interact with. You can delete things, and real world obviously doesn't operate in those rules. And so the real world creates more anxiety, right? And it's harder to navigate. And people then further retreat into those curated communities that feel safer.
Yeah, and of course, this then ties into empathy because if you're less tolerant of someone, then obviously you can't feel empathy for what they're going through because you've already decided that
Mhm.
they're lesser than because, fill in the blank. Um,
Mhm.
and I,
It's again that discomfort, right? Like that discomfort of difference becomes even more intolerable.
yeah, what now that you mentioned that, I actually wanted to ask you something because a lot of the things that mental health specialists talk about is like coping mechanisms and like things that can actually help you deal with trauma or like I suffer from panic attacks and so I have things that help me see myself through them. And
Mhm.
some might argue that, okay, well, you're trying to lessen the discomfort, which is true, but I'm also recognizing that the only way out is through, right? It's kind of like giving
Mhm.
birth. Like I can't
Mhm.
scroll through the end.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I'm curious also like what that does to our ability to actually access things that would be helpful, like coping mechanisms that are helpful, grounding, the only way out is through, when we have this idea that we can just, oh, I can just scroll past the discomfort. What does that do to
Yeah.
our ability to actually live life, which, as you pointed out, is actually full of discomfort, even if you have like a quote unquote good, happy life?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, it's up dialing the coping mechanism of avoidance, which is not the most adaptive coping mechanism, right? That's the one that gets leveraged the most. That's the muscle that gets overused. And at the expense of a spate of other coping tools that involve, like you're saying, working through effectively, sitting with it, not ruminating necessarily, but still sitting with it, processing it, digesting it, reframing it, again, assigning it meaning, purpose, channeling it into altruism. You just can't use those other coping mechanisms if you can't pay attention to that feeling and let it sit with you for a bit. Um, so it diminishes all the other tools that you have.
Yeah, and with that is because something that I've also heard with regards to mental health is sitting with how you're feeling and approaching it with curiosity rather than judgment. And
Mhm,
as an organizer, when I first heard that, I was like, wow, that sounds like something I should take back to the reducing space. Because what
mhm.
we do so often is we just judge people. We're not
Yeah.
curious, and we don't have the attention span to be curious. We're judgmental. And yet, it seems like one of the tools that is used with regards to mental health is to, look at your own trauma, or your own experiences, your own emotions with curiosity rather than judgment. And so it's like we're having to we're having to have these conversations with ourselves. And I mean, do you feel like that can trickle outwards at some point? But like, how can we even do that with ourselves if we're just constantly told via the ADD social media space that we're not good enough and we need to buy this to do that? And I mean, it just seems like it seems Sisyphean.
Yeah, yeah, being closed off, right? All of those things, again, are what social media exacerbates. And you mentioned curiosity, open-mindedness, non-judgment, which are the core principles of mindfulness. What I think is interesting is like tying back to what you were saying, Amdani said he did in his campaign was go into the neighborhoods that had swung towards Trump and just ask the voters what prompted that, right? I mean, there's this idea even, like liberal intolerance and it's so I don't think this is one party's problem. I think it's just a function of the times of against again polarized views and echo chambers, and it's become almost impossible to sit with empathy, curiosity, and understand what behooved people to behave the way they did and make the choices that they did. And I think that, he showed us, Zoran Mamdani showed us in his campaign how he did that. And his approach really was curiosity of those voters. And just by doing that, right, they swung back. So I think, curiosity and non judgment is such a big driver of empathy. You really can't have empathy for somebody who you viscerally hate. And hate really is born from that judgment, right? Of like assuming that somebody is beyond redemption, not seeing in them the same drivers, the same primal instincts that you might have, not recognizing their humanity based on how they act. So it's tough. It's because especially now, like it's just really difficult now with how far we've gone down that road. But I definitely think curiosity goes such a long way in just building back those connections and that understanding of one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And listeners to the show will have heard me say this a million times. But as somebody who grew up in the South and has done a lot of work in the South, and particularly like poor white rural areas, I think one of the most powerful things that I've learned is sit on a porch with somebody and have a beer and say, "Hey, you don't trust the Democrats? Neither do I. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about why
Mhm,
you then voted for Trump or why you voted for
mhm,
Bush or whatever.
mhm.
Like, let's talk about it." And you start to realize that like y'all like you for the most part want the same ends. It's just that the means to which that you want to get there has been completely warped
Mhm.
by intense propagandization and isolation.
Yeah.
You see this a lot in poor rural communities in the South. These communities have been torn apart by
Mhm.
industry, by the profit motive. And I think that having that ability to sit down and pay attention, like actually pay attention, not sit there with a clipboard and be like, "Will you sign this?" Whatever, but like actually pay attention is so important. But this also speaks to one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, which is, like the empathy tank, so to speak. Um,
Mhm.
Empathy exhaustion. Like I've experienced this myself, and I've heard people say that after organizing like a lot of mutual aid, for instance, after a hurricane, you're not just
Mhm.
exhausted by like the weight of the physical work, but emotionally by sharing in the suffering of so many people. How do we then like stay engaged in things and not pull back into the comfort of a little phone, that's
Yeah.
showing us pictures of people's oatmeal or whatever? How do we
Mhm.
stay engaged without being incapacitated by empathy exhaustion? Because we know that so many people are suffering, not just right here, but globally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, in both of these, what we just talked about and right now, again, it goes back to the idea of we have to reclaim the power of the collective. We're not operating individually in an island, whether it's someone who, has been fed systemic propaganda, like you were talking about. There's systemic drivers to why that individual made the choice they did. A whole collective of billionaires and lobbyists acted to have that individual make a certain choice. And, even when it comes to what you're talking about, like mutual aid, organizing, again, it's not the power of the individual, it's the power of the collective. And so what that means is recognizing that individuals' limits are much shorter, much more in each individual has tighter limits than the whole collective does. And so when someone's experiencing burnout, when someone's going through their own thing, that's where you again turn to that collective of I'm going to step back towards this role that maybe allows me to carry a lighter burden for some time. And another person, another group of people can step in. So I think it really goes back to recognizing that we just have more strength in numbers, that one individual's strength offsets another individual's weakness. And that's how collective power really works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think perhaps the hardest thing we have to learn is how to be a collective when the US culture is so much about individualism and isolationism and not being in
Mhm.
community. I think it seems like before we can even learn and work the muscle of empathy, it seems like we have to learn and work the muscle of like community building.
Yeah, which is tied into the muscle of tolerating discomfort, right? You have to be willing to give things of yourself in order to be a part of a collective. There has to be an element of discomfort, sacrifice, letting go. These principles just don't jive well in an individualistic, capitalistic society. This is something I talked about. My husband had gone to Gaza twice last year to volunteer for medical missions, and it wasn't something that I was, thrilled about. It was a really hard decision, um, but it needed to be done. someone has to go. A contingent of people have to go. They needed doctors. They need people with families, who are willing to offer these skills and go there even when it's difficult. And so I think it kind of goes back to this idea of doing difficult things for the collective good. I'll end with that we have to be willing to give something of ourselves for the collective to have success and power. We have to be willing to tolerate individual discomfort for greater purpose and meaning, and honestly individual gain. I mean, collective gain, when everyone when it's funny because in couples therapy, one of my the couples therapist my husband and I went to, she had this phrase: when you each lose, the marriage wins. When every individual is willing to give a little bit of themselves, the collective power wins, and every individual ultimately does win from that.
Yeah. And so, wrapping up here, I wanted to ask you because you had this line that it made me shudder. You wrote, "What remains of the embodied world besides a bunch of disengaged people who feel a listlessness that they can't explain, who sit next to one another and stare into a portal to escape the ennui, not recognizing that perhaps it's the cause." End quote.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, it's uncomfortable. But it's real. It's like a science fiction that's science reality. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering like what's your prescription, doctor? Like what like how do we engage with, because like you said earlier, you're not saying like let's all just be Luddites and throw away all our devices and go,
Mhm.
live out off the grid. But like how do we engage with these devices and these spaces knowing what their purpose is, that it is this very nefarious purpose that they're drawing us in for, and yet we want to see the reports, we want to be able to engage with with things that are going on, and even as you pointed out, even just with family. So how do we engage in these spaces and these devices without letting them actually rewire our humanity?
Yeah, well, and you're asking the $1,000,000 question, right? And I think it gets increasingly harder to do it when we stay in individual frames. And I understand the needs. Like it's a this is not an individual problem. I think we first have to start there. These are not individual screen addictions that are happening. There is a systemic driver that is collectively disintegrating our interconnectedness. And in order to regulate it, in order for there to be the kind of systems level change that needs to happen, we have to organize systematically. And that gets so much harder to do. It's almost a catch-22 because we need to move out of our individuality to recognize that it's a collective problem and address it collectively, but it gets so much harder to do when the product itself tries so hard to cement that individuality. In the book Stolen Focus, the author talks about how this is not the first time there has been a toxic product in the market, right? Like, for example, he gives the example of lead in paint, and how a contingent of parents were really at the forefront of making that change to regulate paint so that it wouldn't have lead in it and literally poison their children. We're not at the point where we are in collective agreement that this is poison, but I think that this is a poison to society. It is a net negative, not a net positive. And I think there really has to be that collective organizing at the industry level of regulating this as a product that has potential implications to our brains, just like lead. Lead poisoned kids' brains. And early smartphone use, early Instagram use, these things are poisoning adolescent brains, particularly adolescent girls' brains. And so it really requires it has to be at the policy level. What that actually looks like, there has to be tighter regulations. The current business model of these companies is it requires us to pay attention. That again is the product. That's their commodity is our attention. And in their current business model, there's no reason for them to change. That's what enables their profitability. There has to be either regulation at the government level or a complete redoing of the business model that will actually create change. There has to be and actually in his book there's also some previous things that used to happen, like scroll bars, right? Or clicking next on a page. You had to intentionally decide whether or not to engage further with the product. Those things are can come back. Those things are part of the code, but they were removed intentionally to keep us connected to the product, right? To take our attention. We have to have those kinds of things back. It's just that in the current business model, that's not profitable. So the rules have to be rewritten on these products.
Yeah, and I mean, it feels like the since everything is a profit model, and basic things that we need to survive, like food and water and healthcare, are profit motives as opposed to just being available. It does seem quite the uphill task, but again, something definitely to think about, especially for adolescents. But indeed, I mean, there are people my age, and I'm 38, that can't go anywhere without their phones, otherwise they feel naked. And some
Yeah.
reflection on
And
that.
right, and I mean, these things prey on vulnerable populations, and all of us on some level are vulnerable. I think even elderly people, right? Like I
Hmm.
hear stories of scam bots through
Right.
text message, right? That have like taken adults' life savings. I mean, at some point we have to step back and ask, like, why are we allowing this to happen? And, like you said, it's an uphill battle. It feels impossible until it's done. It feels like a big undertaking, and it certainly is. But that my hope is that that's the trajectory we move in as, regulating these things as products, recognizing that the harm is there, as it was in lead, as it has been in smoking, as it has been in other addictive and poisonous
Hmm.
items. But I think when someone is feeling overwhelmed, I mean, for me, I have little kids, and sometimes, some days it's just the best I could do is raise kids to have a sense of justice and collectivism and empathy too, to model that for them, and to try to at least raise a counterbalance, right, to a world that is going to tell them that it should be all about individual gain. It shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And we recently had on the show Dr. Kim Wilson and Maya Shenwar, who are the editors of We Grow the World Together, Parenting Toward Abolition. And there's a lot
Mhm,
of beautiful commentary there about not just parents, but those who know kids or are around
mhm,
kids,
mhm,
and the power of showing and emulating alternatives and saying, yes, the world is so broken in so many ways, but we can build beautiful things and we can do beautiful things. And here's an example of that. And how can we tap into like kids' imaginations in order to do that?
mhm,
And I think that's also the thing is like, I feel like one of the things that I'm most afraid of just as a parent is that my kid has such a beautiful imagination, and these devices are meant to stifle that. They kill
yeah,
imagination. And I
mhm,
don't want him to lose that. And so how I feel like there's so many reasons to battle against this, but like we need beautiful imaginations
mhm,
for to build a better future. And so I think I think that's a really core aspect. And I mean, it's an uphill battle, but we actually do have a choice as compared to, when we log on, we don't actually have a choice. We have the illusion of choice.
mhm,
So we actually
mhm,
have a choice to engage and to battle against this. So I think, there's the silver lining, um, if
mhm.
there is one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So thank you so much, Dr. Mushtak, for coming onto the program and talking about these issues. Folks can check out Dr. Mushtak's Substack, The Middle Path. Is there anywhere else where you'd like to direct folks?
No, Substack is a great way to connect with me.